The Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes. Chapter 4. Soul. Creative Medium. We have spoken of the threefold nature of reality, or God, the trinity of being, as spirit, soul, and body, conscious intelligence, subjective law, and form. This threefold unity of reality has been taught by most of the great spiritual philosophies and religions that have been given to the world. We are using the word soul in the sense of a universal soul, or medium, through which spirit operates. It is the Holy Ghost, or third person of the Christian Trinity. Like the creative soil in which seeds are planted and from which plant life comes, the soul of the universe is the creative medium into which the word of spirit falls, and from which creation arises. We should not, however, think of soul and spirit as separate from each other. They are really two parts or aspects of the same thing, each being self-existent and co-eternal with the other. The term subjective mind is used in speaking of the universal soul, rather than the term subconscious mind, to avoid the impression that subjective means unconscious. Mind never could be unconscious. The soul is subjective to spirit, receives impressions from spirit. The subjective mind, which we call soul, is not a knower in the sense that spirit is. It is not self-conscious. It knows only to do without knowing why it does. It is a doer or executor of the will of the spirit and has no choice of its own. It is the business of soul to reflect the images that spirit casts into it. Subjective intelligence. The soul is immaterial as we think of matter, but it is the substance of spirit, and perhaps we could use the expression, the matter of spirit. As all matter in the physical world is supposed finally to resolve into the ether from which it came, we may think of the substance of soul as we think of the ether of science, and realize that all form finally becomes soul stuff again. Perhaps the simplest way would be to think of it as the last and final analysis of matter. We continue to use this word in the face of the knowledge that scientists in theory have already done away with matter. We know that matter comes from somewhere, and the teaching is that soul stuff is the source from which it comes. We must, however, distinguish soul stuff from soul. Soul is subjective intelligence, the principle just beneath spirit. For while soul may not have the conscious intelligence to choose, it certainly has the intelligence to execute the desire of spirit. It is never in any sense unconscious. The soul of the universe is next in principle to spirit and is the servant of spirit. The term soul stuff refers to the primordial or undifferentiated substance from which all things are made. While the soul may not choose, having no self-consciousness of its own, yet it has an intelligence which is infinite, compared to the intelligence which we exhibit. For instance, the combined intelligence of the race could not create the life of a plant, yet the intelligence in the creative soil of the earth will produce as many for us as we ask, when we plant the seed of that which we wish to have created. The same principle holds good in that greater creative medium of the spirit, which we call the soul of the universe. It has the intelligence and power to produce, but no choice as to what it is to produce. Having no conscious mind of its own, it receives all ideas given it, and tends to create a form around them. If it could choose, it could reject, and this is as impossible as for the soil to say, "You must not plant spinach this year, you must plant cauliflower." We can imagine what consternation would prevail throughout the world if just once the soil failed to function according to the law of its nature. We need not be disturbed by such a fear. It is bound to accept and act, It does not argue, but at once begins to create a likeness to the pattern given it. If we say petunias, right back to us it says petunias, and begins immediately the business of producing them. Being a neutral, creative medium, which knows neither good nor bad, it is conscious only of its own ability to do. This is why some of the earlier philosophers referred to the universal soul, or creative medium, as a blind force, not knowing, only doing. This we know to be true of the nature of all law. We are not discussing the nature of the spirit. We are talking about law. Law. It must be apparent by now that the creative medium of spirit is the great mental law of the universe. It is the law, obeying the will of the spirit. It is the universal law of mind. All law is mind in action. Soul is the medium through which all law and power operate. Being subjective, it cannot analyze, dissect, or deny. Because of its nature, it must always accept. The karmic law, which means the law of cause and effect, works through the medium of the universal soul, which is the creative principle of nature and the law of spirit. Let us bear in mind that neither spirit nor the soul of the universe were ever created. Each is eternal. Because this impartial, impersonal soul is the medium through which spirit works, and because it is a blind force, not knowing, only doing, it was called by the ancients Maya, from which arose the teachings of the illusions of the mind, the mirror of the mind. What is termed subjective mind, as the average person comprehends it, has no existence. In reality, there is no such thing as your subjective mind and my subjective mind. If our subjective minds were isolated and things of themselves, we would be so completely separated that there would be no means by which we could communicate with each other. The next great bridge that psychology must cross is a recognition that what is called your subjective mind and my subjective mind is merely the place where universal subjectivity, the creative medium itself, reacts to our personal use of it. Within us, then, there is a creative field which we call subjective mind, and around us there is a field which we call universal subjectivity. One is universal, the other individual, but in reality they are one. There is one mental law in the universe, and where we use it, it becomes our law, because we have individualized it. It is impossible to plumb the depths of the individual mind, because it is not really individual, but individualized. Behind or within the individualized point is the universal, which has no limits. In this concept alone lies the possibility of an endless and eternal expansion. Everyone is universal on the subjective side of life, and individual only at the point of conscious perception. We use the power of the universal mind every time we think. How we use the creative principle. If, through the law, thought is creative, we cannot say that one thought will create while another will not. We must admit that all thought is creative, according to the impulse, emotion, or conviction behind the thought. Our theory is that the medium is a universal simultaneous presence, and in this presence all live, and that whatever is known at one point in it is known at all points instantly. So if we, practicing the principle in Los Angeles, declare the truth about some John Smith who lives in New York or at any other place in the world, the speaking of his name draws the law into the vibration of his personality, his individuality. Mentally, physically, spiritually, he is now in it. We have, so to speak, tuned into the keynote of his being. This being is also at the center of our being. Therefore, the mental work is done in our being. For him, but it must and does operate through law. This law is subjective. Mind and ether. In an interesting article by Sir Oliver Lodge, in which he writes about ether and the laws of the physical universe, he says that no two physical particles really touch each other, no two electrons. They are all divided from each other by a space which is relative to the space between the planetary bodies, and they never once touch each other throughout their existence, other than through the medium of this ether. Lodge calls the ether the cement of matter. His theory is that just as the laws of attraction and repulsion, gravitation, adhesion, and cohesion operate through the ether, so there must be a universal mind that operates upon the ether, or upon mind, or that mind must operate upon mind through the medium of the ether, or perhaps the ether is mind. His conclusion is that mind and ether interact. We think of the ether of mind as a universal subjectivity, the soul of the universe, just as the ether of space is a medium for physical action. So this universal subjectivity is the medium for mental action. Anything that has ever been thought at any time in the history of man exists today in a subjective state in universal mind. When we get into the field of mind, there is no past, present, or future. They merge into one medium. How can spirit create? No one has ever plumbed the depths of either the conscious or the subjective life. In both directions we reach out to infinity, and since we cannot encompass infinity, we shall always be expanding and always enlarging our capacity to know and to experience. We do not need to ask why these things are so. There can be no reason given as to why the truth is true. How can spirit of itself create a new form? I do not know. As Newton said, the fact that we are able to announce the mystery is the mystery. We do not say to the physicist who has studied and photographed the atom, why does it act as it does? He knows no more about the reason for its action than we do. All that he knows is that he has learned something of the way the laws of nature operate. We do not create laws and principles, but discover and make use of them. Let us accept this position relative to the laws of mind and spirit, and see what we can do with them, rather than how we may contradict their existence. The soul reasons deductively. Before we leave this subject of soul, we should understand perfectly that it is impossible to divide mind. We speak of the conscious and the subjective, the self-conscious and the unconscious, and the terms are confusing unless we remember that consciousness is always a unity. We arbitrarily divide the different activities of consciousness in order that we may discuss how thought works. There are two ways of reasoning, the inductive and the deductive method. Inductive reasoning is an inquiry into the truth. It is a process of analysis. Deductive reasoning follows an already established premise. It is from the whole to the part. Since inductive reasoning is an analysis, an inquiry into truth, it follows that God can only reason deductively, since God is truth. That which is infinite does not have to inquire into truth. Consequently, there can be no inductive reasoning either in the spirit or the soul of the universe. There can be no inductive reasoning in spirit because it already knows all things. There can be no inductive reasoning in the soul of the universe because it is the creative medium. And if it could reason inductively, it could reject certain thoughts because it could analyze. And soul or subjectivity can never reject. It is bound by its own nature to accept. It is impersonal and neither knows nor cares who uses it. It is formless, having no mind of its own. It has been called the universal feminine, or the holy womb of nature, because it is receptive and creative. It is karmic law because it is subjective to the knowing mind. It is the medium of the law of cause and effect, of all race suggestion. If a misshapen being from darkest Africa were to plant pink roses, the soil would produce just as lovely flowers for him as for the most beautiful picture star. All that would be necessary in either case would be a compliance with the law regarding the planting of roses. So the soul is without conscious consciousness, but is conscious in relationship to the impressions it has received, whether they be truth or only belief, and with mathematical certainty and precision, backed by the law of its own being, it proceeds to execute the ideas given it. Thus it is plainly seen that the soul can only reason deductively. Subjectivity, never an entity. The subconscious, or subjective, is never an entity, although it acts as though it were. The creative medium is a medium only, never a person. It is necessary that we understand this, because one of the first things a practitioner has to do is to separate the belief from the believer. From the standpoint of the spiritual man, disease, poverty, unhappiness, and misery are neither person, place, nor thing. When we give a treatment, that treatment is a spiritual entity in a subjective world, and it has ways and means and methods to project itself, which the conscious mind knows nothing of, and yet it is subject to the conscious thought. Plotinus had a clear concept when he said, "Nature is the great no thing, yet it is not exactly nothing, because it is its business to receive the impressions of spirit." He spoke of that which we call undifferentiated substance as an indeterminate thing having no mind of its own. Its mind is always made up for it. Most of this chapter has dealt with the universal soul, but in another chapter we shall discuss more fully the manner in which man reenacts the nature of God. End of chapter 4. And so, in synopsis of chapter 4, since in our last chapter, chapter 3, we discussed spirit, and we're talking about the triune nature of God, or life, now we're delving into soul. Remember, this is the medium. This is the creative law of the universe. You can think of this as the soil if you were planting a plant. You, being conscious spirit, you could choose what kind of seed you're going to plant. If you want to plant roses, you would get your rose seeds, and you'd plant them in the soil. Then the soil, being receptive, not having conscious intelligence, unable to reject anything or analyze anything, it would simply get right to work in creating your rose. And just as long as you watered the soil, meaning you would say your positive affirmations of truth, and you would make sure that no weeds got in there. So any thought that would contradict your idea, you would have to deny. That's how you tend to the soil. Then the rest would just be done completely automatically, and in a good amount of time. You can never say how much time it's going to take, because the law works out all of those details. But sure enough, your roses will bloom. And then the manifestation of the rose is what we call body. So it's spirit, soul, and body. And we'll get into the body in the next chapter. So we're taking this one step at a time, but the three parts are never separate from each other. They intersphere each other, and it's one continuous action of creation that's always going on. So there's a lot going on in this chapter, and we're really talking just on a universal level right now more than an individual level. So there's this creative medium, and it's the air that we breathe. It's the invisible world that's all around us. And it also runs through all the forms. So it's the space between the forms, and it's also the space that's occupying the same space as the form. There's nowhere that this formless substance doesn't exist. It runs through everything. And this formless substance is always taking form, always changing form, always ready to jump into a new form. And it all depends on the conscious idea of the spirit, which is us. Whatever we decide to manifest, the universal subjectivity is ready to go. It won't reject anything. So that's why it's so important that we only think truth. We don't want to manifest bad things, because the law will manifest bad things as easily as it will manifest good things. It doesn't have the ability to reason. It doesn't have the ability to reject anything. It just does. That's all it does. It's very automatic. It's not an entity. It's not the spirit. It's just the servant of the spirit. And it's just a medium. So it's very interesting. And it's also very important to remember that there is just one mind. This is the part of this whole book that's so crucial to get, but it takes a long time to seep in. So I'm going to keep reiterating this, that there's just only one mind. And you can think of this one mind as the formless substance, the ether that runs through everything. Because if we each had an isolated mind, there would be no medium through which we could communicate with each other. So you really have to ponder that. If we each were isolated minds, we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. There's one giant circle, and we are all little circles, but that same big circle is running through all of us. And that's how we communicate. Now, we each have our own point in mind, and we each have control of what we do with our individual use of mind. So, but it's important to understand that since there's only one mind, what's known in one point can be known in every point simultaneously. So if there's some piece of information that I need and it's in China, and I set my intention that this information is now known to me, I can draw it into my conscious awareness. It doesn't matter where it is. And that's how treatment is done also. I can treat somebody who lives far, far away, but when I speak the word of truth into my own mind, since there's only one mind, it'll be felt everywhere simultaneously, so long as that person is receptive. So it's very interesting, and as we delve more and more into this, that's a concept that I'll probably keep repeating a lot about the one mind. So I'm so excited to get on to the next chapter on body.